I am Blythe Noel. I am 25 years old, and last Saturday, my own mother dropped an antique porcelain plate, shattering it across the oak floorboards of our ancestral dining room. She did this because of 7 quiet words my grandfather spoke from the head of the table. 7 words that stopped a secret real estate deal in its tracks and stripped her of a legacy she was trying to steal from right under his feet. I want you to picture the shock on her face because she thought she had outsmarted us all. Before I explain exactly how my husband David legally outmaneuvered a family that spent 5 years treating him like dirt on their boots, welcome to QT Told Stories. If quiet, calculated justice and airtight boundaries are your kind of story, you are in the right place. Drop a comment telling me your age and where you are watching from today, and be sure to subscribe. The conflict did not start with a fractured plate. It started the second David parked his sedan on the gravel driveway of the family estate. We live in western North Carolina. In my family Appalachian bloodlines, and the deed to your land mean more than the money in your checking account. We preach the gospel of Southern hospitality. We pride ourselves on open doors and sweet tea. But that hospitality carries a rigid, unspoken clause. It is extended exclusively to the right kind of people. People whose last names are carved into local bank cornerstones. People who possess hundreds of acres of prime timber. David brought none of those things. He is an IT specialist from Chicago. He processes data. His hands are clean. We had driven 4 hours straight from the city, the trunk heavy with the elaborate side dishes my mother insisted we provide for the annual family reunion. When we walked through the heavy front doors, the foyer smelled of roasting pork, lemon Polish, and old money. My mother, Loretta, stood waiting near the staircase. She wore a tailored pastel linen dress and a smile that hovered miles away from her eyes. She did not offer a hug. She did not offer a greeting. Instead, her gaze dropped straight to David's polished leather loafers. She stared at his city shoes the way a person inspects a termite on a baseboard. She walked past me without a single glance. She picked up a heavy splintered crate of split oak firewood resting near the entryway bench, turned, and shoved it directly into David's chest. "The back porch needs stocking," she instructed. She did not ask, she did not say please. She pivoted on her heel and glided toward the kitchen, leaving us standing in the drafty hall. That was the first layer of conflict, a silent surgical assignment of manual labor. It was an instant geographical marker of his status. In 10 seconds, Loretta established the hierarchy of the weekend. On her ancestral land, my husband was not an invited guest. He was the hired help. David adjusted his grip on the rough wood. The jagged bark snagged the fabric of his crisp dress shirt. He did not sigh. He did not complain. He just met my eyes, gave a brief nod, and walked toward the back door to do exactly as he was told. The board was set, and my family had no idea who they were playing against. I left David navigating the heavy southern humidity and walked through the swinging doors into the kitchen. The air conditioning inside was turned down to a frigid temperature, a stark contrast to the thick August heat baking the front porch. The room smelled of simmering collard greens, roasted garlic and vinegar, familiar scents that usually brought comfort. Today, the aroma just felt like the preamble to an exhaustion I knew all too well. I washed my hands at the farmhouse sink, grabbed a paring knife from the block, and pulled a sack of yellow onions onto the cutting board. Here is a pebble of truth about my place in this lineage. I work as a rural clinic administrator. My daily life revolves around logistics. I manage complex medical schedules, wrangle uncooperative insurance providers, and ensure a busy health center runs without friction. Because of this skill set, my family treats me as their personal unpaid assistant. I am the one they call to reset their forgotten passwords or argue with the cable company. I balance the checkbooks when the math does not add up, and I decode the confusing letters from their cardiologists. I perform the labor that keeps their lives functioning smoothly. But the defining feature of this dynamic is that no one sees you doing it. I am entirely unnoticed until the exact moment I stop being useful. My older sister Savannah sat across the marble island. She was not chopping onions. She was perched on a leather bar stool, casually stirring a glass of iced sweet tea with a long silver spoon. Savannah is the golden child of our generation. She has always operated under a permanent exemption from labor. From childhood chores to holiday hosting, she possessed a magical ability to be busy with something prestigious whenever actual work was required. 3 years ago, she fulfilled my mother's ultimate fantasy by marrying a man named Wyatt. Wyatt is a local heir, the son of a family that owns 3 farm equipment dealerships and a vast expanse of fertile acreage just beyond the county line. By marrying him, Savannah secured her status as the pristine custodian of our heritage. She wore crisp white linen pants and a delicate silk blouse, an outfit meticulously selected to communicate that she would not be subjected to the grease and grime of preparing the reunion dinner. Loretta drifted back into the kitchen, a damp polishing cloth in her hand. She leaned against the counter right next to Savannah. She did not look in my direction. She did not ask how the 4 hours of highway traffic had been. She did not ask about the administrative promotion I had earned 3 weeks prior, an achievement I had proudly shared in our group chat, only to be met with dead silence. My milestones do not register on her radar because they do not involve acres of land or a prominent local surname. Instead, Loretta placed a hand on Savannah's shoulder and asked if Wyatt's new diesel truck was running smoothly. Savannah smiled, taking a slow sip of her tea, and launched into a detailed recount of their recent vehicle purchase, the upgraded towing package, and Wyatt's plans for the upcoming hunting season. I stood 2 feet away, listening to the rhythmic thud of my knife against the wooden board. The onion skin peeled away in thin, papery layers, stinging my eyes, providing a convenient excuse for any moisture gathering in my eyelashes. The conversation shifted from trucks to the family estate. The topic of the land is always a sacred liturgy in our house, spoken with reverence and unearned superiority. Savannah swirled the ice in her glass and projected her voice just enough to ensure I caught every syllable. She remarked that maintaining a legacy required a specific type of grit. She stated clearly that the property needed to stay exclusively in the hands of people who understood soil and roots. It was a direct, calculated jab at David. My husband is an IT specialist who grew up in the suburbs of Chicago. He builds database architectures and secures hospital networks. He possesses an intellect that runs circles around Wyatt's tractor brochures, but because David's expertise does not involve crop rotations or deer blinds, Savannah considered him a lesser species. Wyatt inherited his position, David built his career from scratch. Yet Savannah wanted me to hear that my choice of a partner had permanently disqualified me from the bloodline. I did not pause my chopping. I did not look up, and I certainly did not argue. Over the years, I have learned a hard lesson about engaging with people who keep their own score. Fighting them is pointless. They construct the rules, tally the points, and move the goalposts whenever they sense they might lose. If I defended David's career, Savannah would merely twist my words into an accusation that I thought I was better than them. If I pointed out David's work ethic, Loretta would dismiss it with a condescending sigh. So I kept my mouth shut and focused the blade of the knife. I let the silence stretch out, offering them zero friction. The real danger arrived a few minutes later, slipping into the conversation disguised as casual gossip. Loretta began polishing a silver gravy boat, her movements slow and deliberate. She lowered her voice, adopting a tone of sorrowful concern that she reserves for church prayer circles. She mentioned that she had been watching Grandpa Harlan closely over the past few months. She said his mind was slipping. She claimed he was forgetting conversations, misplacing his keys, and struggling to manage his daily routines. Savannah nodded solemnly, playing her part in the performance perfectly. She reached across the counter and patted our mother's hand, offering fake sympathy for the burden of elder care. Then Loretta dropped the anchor. She stated smoothly and without hesitation that it was time to restructure the estate. She said they needed to step in and take the reins before Harlan made a mistake that could jeopardize the family holdings. My knife stopped moving. The kitchen went deathly quiet except for the hum of the refrigerator. That single phrase, restructure the estate, was not an expression of daughterly worry. It was the second layer of conflict landing with cold, undeniable clarity. It was a quiet admission of a legal coup wrapped tightly in Southern concern. I see Grandpa Harlan every Tuesday for lunch. I manage his medical chart. His mind is sharper than a hunting knife. He might move slower and his knees might ache when the rain rolls over the ridge, but his cognitive function is pristine. Loretta's claim was a calculated fabrication. She was not trying to help Harlan remember where he put his reading glasses. She was laying the psychological groundwork to declare him incompetent. They were discussing stripping the patriarch of his autonomy, while I stood 3 feet away chopping vegetables, assuming I was too docile or too distracted to decode their language. They thought my silence meant I was ignorant. They believed my role as the invisible fixer extended to this moment, that I would simply nod and accept their version of reality just as I accepted their neglected routers and unpaid bills. I stared at the diced onions on the board. My mind rapidly categorized the information, a skill I use daily in the clinic to triage crises. If Loretta was boldly floating the idea of restructuring the estate in front of me, she already had a plan in motion. She already knew the destination, and this conversation was merely the first phase of setting the narrative. She wanted to plant the seed that Harlan was failing, so that when the deed transferred, no one in the extended family would question the legality of the move. I wiped my hands on my stained apron. The stinging in my eyes had nothing to do with the vegetables anymore. It was the sharp metallic sting of betrayal. They were plotting to steal the ground out from under an old man who had spent his entire life cultivating it, and they were doing it while drinking sweet tea in his kitchen. 2 hours after the scheduled start time, the heavy roar of a modified diesel engine echoed up the long gravel driveway. Wyatt had finally arrived. He swung the front door open, bringing the thick, humid air of the afternoon inside with him. His heavy work boots left distinct clumps of red clay across the pristine entryway rug. In any other circumstance, my mother would have scolded a guest for ruining the antique fabric. Today, she simply beamed. To Loretta, that red clay was not dirt. It was evidence of Wyatt working the earth, a tangible symbol of his inherited local royalty. Loretta rushed out of the kitchen, abandoning her silver polishing. She greeted her golden son-in-law with an enthusiastic embrace, her pastel dress pressing against his sweaty flannel shirt. She immediately walked to the specialized cooler reserved for favored guests and handed him a cold imported beer. At that exact moment, David stepped inside from the back patio. While my mother and sister had been whispering their legal strategies over iced tea, my husband had noticed the heavy wooden screen door sagging on its frame. Without being prompted, he had retrieved his personal toolkit from his car trunk, removed the rusted screws, realigned the heavy oak frame, and installed fresh hardware. He wiped a small streak of graphite grease from his thumb with a paper towel. He stood near the hallway, a quiet presence, holding a screwdriver, having just repaired a piece of the estate that had been broken for 3 years. Loretta looked right at him. She saw the tool in his hand. She saw the perfectly aligned door behind him. She did not offer him a beer. She did not offer him a glass of water. She simply turned her back and ushered Wyatt into the main living room to hold court. We followed them into the den, joining the expanding circle of extended relatives. The room was a shrine to generational pride. Mounted deer heads stared down from the pine-paneled walls, and faded property maps hung in heavy wooden frames. Several cousins, aunts, and uncles had already claimed seats on the oversized leather sofas. When Wyatt walked in, the room shifted. Relatives sat up straighter, uncles leaned forward to shake his hand. Savannah glided over to stand beside him, resting her hand on his forearm to solidify their joint status as the reigning couple of the upcoming generation. David and I took a seat on a small, stiff, upholstered bench near the fireplace, physically placed on the outer edge of the gathering. Here is a crucial detail about my husband. David grew up in a dense urban neighborhood. He paid his own way through a demanding university by working overnight security shifts. He built a lucrative career in data architecture through sheer intellect and late nights. He is a self-made man in every sense of the phrase. However, in this specific living room, earned success holds zero currency. My relatives worship inherited ease. They trust people who have never had to leave the county line to secure their futures. To them, an outsider who earns his way is inherently suspicious, while a local son who is handed his fortune is a natural leader. Wyatt took a long pull from his bottle and began dominating the conversation. He steered the topic toward a new hunting lease he was negotiating near the river basin. He spoke loudly, using broad hand gestures to describe the acreage and the specific bucks he intended to track this season. The uncles nodded in solemn agreement, treating his recreational plans like crucial geopolitical strategy. Cousin Caleb chimed in to praise Wyatt for securing such prime real estate, feeding the ego of the room. David leaned forward slightly. He does not hunt, but he understands ecosystems, and he genuinely tries to build bridges with these people, despite their constant rebuffs. He waited for a polite lull in the booming laughter. When the room quieted, David mentioned a recent corporate project he had managed. He described partnering with a state conservation department using machine learning and satellite topography data to track seasonal deer migration patterns across shrinking habitats. It was a smart, relevant contribution. It offered a modern perspective on the exact topic Wyatt was discussing. It was an olive branch extended across a vast cultural divide, offering a way to connect his professional world with their rural interests. Loretta did not let the branch land. She set her crystal glass on the coffee table. The sharp clink of glass on wood cut through the quiet room. She looked at David with a sweet, lethal smile. It was the kind of smile Southern women use when they are preparing to draw blood in public. "Oh, David, that is nice," she said, her voice dripping with artificial warmth. "But we are talking about real land management here. City boys just do not have the pedigree for it." The word pedigree left her mouth and hung in the stagnant air of the living room. Pedigree. It is a term reserved for breeding livestock. You use it to evaluate hunting dogs and thoroughbred horses. When you apply that specific word to a human being, you are doing something deliberate. You are classifying them. You are announcing to a room full of people that the target does not possess the correct bloodline, the correct breeding, or the correct intrinsic value to sit at the table. The den fell uncomfortably silent. The cousins exchanged quick, sideways glances. A few of the older uncles looked down at their boots, suddenly very interested in the floorboards. Savannah smirked behind her tea glass, clearly enjoying the spectacle. I felt my pulse pounding in my throat. I opened my mouth to defend him, ready to tear into my mother for the sheer cruelty of the insult. I felt a wave of intense guilt for bringing the man I love into a house where he is treated as a lesser citizen. But before I could form the first syllable of a defense, I felt a firm, steady pressure on my knee. David squeezed my leg. It was a grounding anchor, a silent command telling me to hold my fire. I looked at his profile. He is a quiet man who processes complex algorithms for a living. He does not engage in petty drama. He analyzes threats and responds with logic. I watched the thick muscle in his jaw tighten, a brief physical tell betraying the immense willpower it took to absorb that level of disrespect. This was the third layer of conflict, and I suddenly understood its architecture. This was not a random insult. This public humiliation in front of the extended cousins was a calculated trap. Loretta designed the moment to isolate him. She wanted to push him until he snapped. If David raised his voice, if he defended himself, or if he stormed out of the room, my mother would win. She would immediately play the victim. She would turn to the cousins and whisper about how unstable the city boy was. She would use his reaction as permanent proof that he did not belong in their civilized family. They wanted a scene. They craved a dramatic outburst to validate their prejudice. David denied them the satisfaction. He did not flush red. He did not raise his voice. He simply held my mother's gaze for 3 long seconds, letting the silence stretch until it became suffocating for everyone else in the room. He forced her to sit in the awkwardness of her own venom. Then he offered a polite, impenetrable smile. "Excuse me," David said, his tone perfectly even, devoid of any anger they could weaponize against him. "I am going to check on Grandpa Harlan and see if he needs any help getting ready for dinner." He stood up, adjusted his cuffs, and walked out of the living room with quiet dignity. He left Loretta sitting on the sofa, her sweet smile curdling into a tight line of frustration. Her trap had failed. Her prey had simply walked away, demonstrating a level of class she could not comprehend. David's refusal to play her game only made her angrier, pushing her to seek a different avenue of sabotage. The tension in the house was no longer simmering. It was ready to boil over, and her next move would involve a cherished family heirloom and a blatant attempt to rewrite reality in front of the entire gathering. I left the suffocating air of the living room and headed toward the formal dining area to finish setting the long tables. The back doors were propped open to let in a rare afternoon breeze, a temporary relief from the stifling humidity baking the hillsides. At the corner of the room stood an antique cedar display stand. It was a beautiful, hand-carved piece of furniture, holding framed black and white photographs of our ancestors in various stages of youth and decline. Here is a small truth about that stand. Grandpa Harlan crafted it himself 50 years ago using wood from the very first tree he felled on this property. It was his pride. It served as a physical anchor connecting the past to the present, displaying the faces of the people who had pulled rocks from the fields and built the foundations we now walked upon. The wind picked up, swirling through the screen door. A sudden gust caught the heavy velvet drapes framing the dining room windows, sweeping the thick fabric across the top of the cedar stand. The wood tilted. I stepped forward, reaching out with both hands, but I was too late. The heavy piece tipped backward and hit the hardwood floor with a sickening crack. The base snapped clean off. Framed glass shattered, scattering jagged shards across the woven rug. Savannah shrieked. She rushed in from the hallway, dropping her glass of sweet tea on the threshold. Her face went pale as she stared at the splintered base of Harlan's favorite creation. Loretta was right behind her. My mother surveyed the damage, taking a deep breath, her chest puffing up as she prepared to launch into a full meltdown. Blame was already forming on her lips. She would blame the wind, the open door, and ultimately, she would find a way to blame me for not catching it in time. Before Loretta could utter a single syllable, David walked into the dining room. He had been on his way down the hall after checking on Harlan. He saw the shattered glass, the broken cedar, and my mother preparing to scream. He did not hesitate. He did not ask what happened. He simply turned around, walked out the front door, and went straight to the trunk of his sedan. David is a man who deals in solutions. In his professional life, he isolates corrupted code and builds secure firewalls to protect vulnerable systems. He applies that same methodical care to the physical world. He returned 5 minutes later carrying a heavy canvas tool bag. He knelt on the floor among the broken glass and began to work. He swept the shards aside with a brush, placing the framed photos safely on a nearby chair. Then he examined the splintered cedar base. Loretta and Savannah stood in the corner, offering no help, just watching him with a mixture of suspicion and impatience. David ignored them. He retrieved a small bottle of high-grade wood glue, a set of metal clamps, and a piece of fine sandpaper. He sanded the jagged edges to ensure a flush fit. He applied the glue with careful precision, aligning the grain of the wood so the fracture would be virtually invisible. He secured the pieces together with the clamps, wiping away the excess adhesive with a clean cloth. He told me it would need 30 minutes to set. For half an hour, he sat guard next to the drying wood while I finished arranging the silverware and folding the heavy linen napkins. He did not boast. He did not point out that nobody else in the house possessed the skill or the foresight to carry specialized tools in their vehicle. He just did the work. When the adhesive cured, he removed the clamps, polished the repaired joint with a touch of oil from his kit, and lifted the stand back into its upright position. He replaced every photograph in its exact original arrangement. The stand looked perfect. The break was undetectable. More relatives began arriving, filtering into the house with loud greetings and covered dishes. I took the empty tool bag back to David's car for him, while he went to a guest bathroom to wash the glue from his hands. When I returned to the dining room 10 minutes later, a crowd had gathered around the cedar display. Loretta stood at the center of the group. She was holding court, gesturing toward the polished wood. Wyatt stood right beside her, a smug smile plastered across his face, holding a fresh bottle of beer in his right hand. I walked closer, blending into the edge of the circle, and listened to my mother speak. She was telling Cousin Caleb and his wife about the terrible gust of wind that had nearly destroyed Harlan's favorite piece of furniture. Then she raised her voice, ensuring everyone in the parlor could hear. She placed a hand on Wyatt's shoulder and announced that Wyatt had heroically stepped in to save the day. She claimed Wyatt rushed to his truck, grabbed his tools, and expertly rebuilt the stand before Harlan could discover the accident and suffer a broken heart. Wyatt nodded in agreement. He accepted the praise without a flinch of hesitation. He soaked up the admiration of the older generation playing the part of the rugged, capable guardian of the family estate. He claimed the quiet labor of my husband as his own to bolster his own ego. He stole the credit for a repair he lacked both the tools and the patience to execute. My vision blurred with a flash of white-hot anger. My nails bit deep into the palms of my hands. It was one thing to insult David to his face in the living room, but to steal his physical labor and award it to the golden son-in-law was a new level of depravity. I stepped forward, opening my mouth, prepared to tear the lie to shreds in front of the entire assembly. I was ready to drag Wyatt through the mud and expose my mother for the fraud she was. I caught movement in my peripheral vision. David was standing in the doorway leading to the kitchen. His sleeves were rolled up. His hands were clean. He caught my eye across the crowded room. He did not look angry. He looked serene. He gave his head one slow, subtle shake. He was telling me to stop. He was instructing me to let them have the lie. David did not need their validation. He knew his own worth, and he recognized that engaging in a screaming match over a wooden stand would only feed their desire for chaos. He operated on a plane of quiet confidence that they could never access. I closed my mouth. I stepped back into the shadows of the hallway, letting the false story stand, honoring my husband's silent request for peace. But as I watched my mother continue to parade Wyatt around the room, a chilling realization washed over me. This stolen credit was not just a petty display of favoritism. It was a calculated narrative choice. Loretta was not acting out of simple pride. She was actively building a public story. She was planting evidence in the minds of every relative present today. She was constructing a specific, undeniable picture of the family dynamic for a regional audience that values reputation above all else. In her constructed reality, Wyatt was the capable protector. Wyatt was the man who possessed the skills to manage the estate, fix the broken pieces, and maintain the heritage. By contrast, she was painting David as useless, an invisible outsider who contributed nothing of value to their land or their survival. She needed the extended family to view Wyatt as the natural successor, and David as a weak urbanite who could not even turn a screwdriver. She was setting a stage. This performance was laying the psychological groundwork for something much bigger. She needed the entire bloodline to believe Wyatt was the rightful heir to the responsibility of the property. She was manufacturing consent among the family members. I felt a cold knot form in my stomach. The whispers I had overheard in the kitchen about restructuring the estate were not just idle gossip. They were the first steps of a formalized plan. Loretta was curating public opinion to support a legal maneuver. If everyone believed Wyatt was the hero who maintained the property, no one would blink when his name magically appeared on important documents. The theft of David's repair work was the prologue to a much larger crime, a maneuver I would accidentally uncover in the dimly lit study just an hour later. The true battle line had been drawn, and the enemy was preparing to strike from the shadows. I slipped away from the dining room as the false praises for Wyatt continued to echo against the floral wallpaper. We were running perilously low on the heavy linen napkins required to serve a dinner of this size. I knew exactly where the spares were kept. The journey took me away from the noise of the gathering down a narrow, unlit corridor leading to the secluded back wing of the ground floor. At the very end of this hallway sat the old study. Here is a brief piece of history about that specific room. Decades ago, it was the true nerve center of the property. Grandpa Harlan used to spend his evenings sitting at a heavy mahogany desk, reviewing crop yields, studying soil reports, and balancing ledgers by the warm glow of a brass reading lamp. He managed the estate with meticulous care and quiet pride. However, when his knees started failing a few years ago and he moved to a more accessible downstairs bedroom, my mother commandeered the space. She transformed his sanctuary into a dumping ground for her garden club paperwork, excess holiday decorations, and discarded vanity projects, effectively stripping away its original dignity. The spare linens I needed lived in a deep walk-in storage closet tucked into the back corner of this neglected room. I approached the study quietly. My soft sole shoes made zero sound on the woven runner rug. The heavy oak door was cracked open just a few inches. A sliver of pale afternoon light spilled into the dim corridor, illuminating floating dust motes. I reached out to push the wood aside, but the sound of hushed, frantic voices stopped my hand in midair. I recognized the tones instantly. It was Loretta and Savannah. They were not discussing the pot roast temperature or the seating arrangements for the evening. The cadence of their speech was sharp-clipped and laced with an anxiety they never allowed themselves to display in public. I did not announce my presence. I slid silently through the narrow opening and stepped straight into the deep shadows of the open storage closet. I pressed my back against the cool plaster wall, surrounded by the scent of lavender sachets and mothballs. I held my breath, becoming a ghost in my own childhood home, and listened as the fifth layer of conflict unspooled just a few feet away. Savannah paced across the faded Persian rug. Her silk blouse rustled with every tight, agitated step. She kept her voice low, but the acoustics of the wood-paneled room carried every syllable to my hiding spot with terrifying clarity. She told our mother that Wyatt had secured a firm commitment from his business contact. A real estate developer from Raleigh, an old college fraternity brother of Wyatt, was ready to wire a cash offer by Tuesday morning. The buyer specifically wanted the north pasture. Savannah detailed the plan. The developer intended to bulldoze the old timber stands, clear the generational hunting grounds, and build a subdivision of luxury mountain retreats for wealthy out-of-state vacationers. Savannah sounded breathless, intoxicated by the prospect of incoming capital. But there was a catch, a critical logistical hurdle they needed to clear immediately to finalize the transaction. She insisted the deed transfer had to happen today. She stressed the urgency of having Grandpa Harlan sign the authorization paperwork while the house was full of noisy distractions and while his mind was, according to their newly manufactured narrative, sufficiently confused. The puzzle pieces from the previous hour snapped together with chilling precision. The public praise for Wyatt repairing the wooden stand, the subtle hints dropped in the kitchen about Harlan slipping mentally. It was all a theatrical production designed to justify stripping a capable 82-year-old man of his assets under the guise of protective family intervention. Loretta stopped her pacing. She let out a long, shuddering sigh that betrayed a deep structural panic. My mother, the woman who wore imported linen and poured expensive bourbon for her guests, sounded like a cornered animal. She agreed with Savannah's timeline. She admitted, her voice trembling slightly, that they had run out of time to find an alternative solution. The property taxes were 3 years delinquent. 3 years. I squeezed my eyes shut in the dark closet. The grand Appalachian legacy, the supposed unshakable foundation of our family superiority, was drowning in secret debt. While Loretta hosted lavish holiday galas to impress the neighbors, and Savannah paraded around town in brand new vehicles, the county tax assessor was preparing the final delinquency notices. My mother confessed that if they did not liquidate the north pasture to satisfy the outstanding balance, the local government would seize the entire estate by the end of the month. They were broke. They were living on a stage set made of cardboard and unpaid bills, pretending to be royalty while staring down the barrel of imminent foreclosure. Then the conversation shifted to me. Savannah asked if I suspected anything about their financial distress. Loretta scoffed, a bitter sound that echoed off the mahogany desk. She stated clearly that I could not know a single detail of the transaction. She told Savannah that if I found out about the debt, I would insist on finding a practical way to keep the land intact. She knew I would try to restructure the finances, audit her reckless spending habits, and ruin their lucrative deal with the developer. They planned to cut me out entirely. Because I was married to an IT specialist from Chicago who did not fit their social mold, they deemed me an unworthy participant in the family survival strategy. They were willing to sacrifice the heritage they claimed to worship, enrich a developer, and discard my inheritance, all to maintain their facade of rural aristocracy. Eavesdropping on your own betrayal is a profound physical experience. My hands turned ice cold. The blood pounded in my ears, nearly drowning out the ambient noise of the distant reunion guests outside the window. The natural human instinct in that moment is to burst out of the closet. The urge to kick the door wide open, step into the light, and confront the thieves to their faces is overwhelming. I wanted to scream. I wanted to demand answers for the financial negligence that brought us to the brink of losing everything. I wanted to shame them for plotting to manipulate a proud man into signing away his life's work so they could save face. But I did not move. I remembered David sitting in the dining room just a few minutes prior, holding my gaze and shaking his head. He had taught me the value of tactical patience. A confrontation right now would only trigger their defensive instincts. They would deny the plan, call me crazy for hiding in a closet, and accelerate their timeline to get the signatures before I could warn Harlan. Anger is a useless tool when you are fighting a quiet war of legal paperwork and property deeds. I needed to operate like my husband. I needed to process the raw data, analyze the vulnerabilities in their strategy, and execute a countermeasure without announcing my presence. I stayed glued to the plaster wall until Loretta and Savannah finally exited the study, their heels clicking down the hardwood corridor as they hurried back to rejoin the party. The heavy oak door clicked shut behind them. I waited another full 60 seconds, counting the beats in my head, ensuring the hallway was clear. I stepped out of the closet. The study felt different now. It was no longer a room of neglected memories. It was the staging ground for a crime. I reached into my pocket and retrieved my smartphone. I opened my messaging application and selected David's contact profile. I did not type a long, frantic explanation of the tax delinquency or the developer scheme. I knew David would need the facts delivered in a secure environment, away from the watchful eyes of my mother and sister. My fingers moved quickly over the digital keyboard. I typed 3 simple words: "Meet me outside." I hit send, slipped the device back into my apron pocket, and walked out of the study to face a family that had already decided I was a casualty of their financial survival. I slipped my smartphone back into my apron pocket and moved down the unlit corridor, intent on intercepting my husband before my mother could corner him again. I needed to relay the timeline of the impending real estate theft, but the Appalachian Mountains possess their own unpredictable temper. The stagnant humidity that had been baking the valley all afternoon suddenly broke. The atmospheric pressure dropped like a stone in a pond. Through the hallway windows, I watched the sky bruise from a hazy summer blue to a deep, turbulent purple in a matter of seconds. A fierce gust of wind slammed against the side of the house, rattling the original window panes in their wooden frames. Somewhere out by the county highway, a dead pine branch snapped and fell directly across the main local utility line. The resulting pop sounded like a distant rifle shot. Instantly, the ancestral estate plunged into pitch-black darkness. The sudden absence of electricity silenced the hum of the central air conditioning and the low drone of the kitchen appliances. A collective gasp echoed from the den, followed by the immediate rising murmur of confused relatives. I navigated the dark corridor using memory alone, stepping into the kitchen just as Loretta began to panic. My mother stood near the oversized commercial refrigerator, her hands hovering over the stainless steel handles. That refrigerator held thousands of dollars worth of curated reunion food: cured hams, delicate side dishes, custom-ordered desserts. In the stifling August heat, a prolonged outage meant a total culinary disaster. In Loretta's mind, a ruined dinner equated to a fatal blow to her social standing among the extended cousins. Wyatt stood in the center of the room, illuminating his own face with the flashlight feature of his cellular device. He sighed loudly, complaining that the utility company always took at least 6 hours to dispatch a repair crew to this side of the ridge. He offered no practical solution. He merely narrated the inconvenience, acting as a passive observer to the crisis. David stepped through the swinging door from the dining room. He assessed the panic, the darkness, and Wyatt's useless commentary. My husband did not hesitate. He asked where the backup power supply was located. Loretta, flustered and losing her grip on her perfect hostess persona, waved a hand toward the backyard. She explained there was an old heavy-duty diesel generator housed in the main utility barn. She warned it was temperamental and required a manual start. Wyatt immediately chimed in, claiming the machine was ancient and notoriously stubborn, implying it was a fool's errand for a city resident to even try operating it. David simply nodded. He grabbed a heavy brass flashlight from the emergency hook near the pantry and stated he would get the machine running. He turned and walked out the back door into the rising storm. I started to follow him. I needed to catch him alone to explain the secret debt and the developer scheme I had just uncovered in the study. But as I reached the screen door, I saw Savannah moving quickly through the shadows of the mudroom. She did not grab a raincoat. She did not announce her departure. She slipped out a side door, her silk blouse fluttering in the gale force wind, taking a direct shortcut across the lawn toward the utility barn. My instincts flared. Savannah does not volunteer for manual labor, and she certainly does not sprint through a thunderstorm to offer helpful assistance. I held the screen door catch to prevent it from slamming and trailed behind her, staying hidden in the turbulent darkness. The rain had not yet begun to fall, but the wind whipped the oak branches overhead into a frenzy, masking the sound of my footsteps on the damp grass. The utility barn is a sprawling, corrugated metal structure, sitting 50 yards from the main house. It smells of aged motor oil, dried hay, and rusting iron. Savannah reached the side entrance a full minute before David, who had taken the longer paved path to avoid the mud. I slipped through the sliding front doors, pressing myself behind a tall stack of wooden shipping pallets. I watched my sister execute her petty act of treason. Savannah turned on her phone light, sweeping the narrow beam across the concrete floor until it illuminated the bulky yellow frame of the diesel generator. She did not inspect the control panel. She went straight for the mechanics. She raised her foot, ignoring the dirt scuffing her designer shoe, and delivered a sharp, deliberate kick to the primary fuel line hose connected to the lower intake valve. The heavy rubber hose popped loose from its brass fitting. A slow, steady drip of diesel fuel began to puddle on the concrete. She stepped back, breathing hard. A triumphant smirk crossed her face in the pale light of her screen. Her motive was transparent. She wanted David to fail. She needed him to walk into that barn, pull the cord, and find himself unable to start the engine. She was orchestrating a public failure to reinforce the narrative she and Loretta were building. She wanted the entire family to sit in the dark, waiting for the useless city boy to restore the power, only to watch him return to the house defeated. It would cement his status as an incompetent outsider, right before they asked Harlan to sign away the deed. Before she could retreat to the house, the heavy side door creaked open. David stepped inside, his brass flashlight cutting a bright, steady swath through the gloom. Savannah feigned surprise, quickly tucking her phone away and adopting an expression of innocent concern. She claimed she had just run out to see if he needed help finding the machine in the dark. David did not answer her. He walked directly to the generator. He is an engineer of digital systems, but logic translates across all physical mediums. When a machine fails to operate, you do not panic. You trace the pathway of the necessary resources. He swept his flashlight over the control panel, checked the oil reservoir gauge, and then lowered the beam to the base of the engine block. The light caught the dripping diesel fuel and the disconnected hose lying on the concrete. He saw the problem instantly. Any rational person would recognize that a thick rubber hose secured with a tension clamp does not simply fall off a stationary engine. It requires physical force to dislodge. David looked at the hose, then raised the beam of the flashlight just enough to illuminate Savannah's expensive, dirt-smudged shoe standing 2 feet away. The silence in the barn was heavy, interrupted only by the howling wind battering the metal roof. I braced myself for the confrontation. I expected David to call her out, to demand an explanation for the sabotage, or to march her back to the house to expose her malice to the extended family. Instead, David did the most devastating thing possible. He treated her like she did not exist. He set his flashlight on a nearby workbench, angling the beam to light his workspace. He knelt on the oily concrete, staining the knee of his tailored trousers. He picked up the fuel line, wiped the grit from the brass fitting with his thumb, and firmly reattached the hose, pushing the tension clamp back into its secure locking position. He primed the engine block, adjusting the choke with fluid, confident movements. He stood up, gripped the heavy pull cord, and yanked it backward with a single powerful motion. The old diesel engine coughed once, sputtered, and then roared to life. The deafening mechanical thrum filled the barn, vibrating through the concrete floor. A second later, the automatic transfer switch engaged. The fluorescent overhead lights in the barn flickered and blazed on, bathing the space in stark, unforgiving white light. Through the side windows, I could see the main house light up simultaneously, saving the precious reunion food and ending the brief crisis. Savannah stood frozen in the harsh fluorescent glare. Her sabotage had been thwarted in less than 60 seconds. Her plan to humiliate him had evaporated into thin air. She looked at David, expecting anger, expecting a scolding, expecting some form of engagement she could twist and manipulate later to paint him as the aggressor. David picked up a clean rag from the workbench. He methodically wiped the diesel grease from his hands. He did not look at her. He did not utter a single word of reproach. He tossed the rag onto the bench, picked up his flashlight, and walked straight past her toward the exit. He moved with the calm, terrifying certainty of a man who recognizes an enemy and refuses to engage them on their terms. His silence was louder than any scream. It was a tactical dismissal. By refusing to argue, he denied her the drama she craved. He demonstrated that her petty manipulations were entirely ineffective against him. The conflict was no longer a game of passive-aggressive remarks over sweet tea. It was active warfare. As I watched Savannah fuming in the vibrating hum of the generator, her face flushed with the embarrassment of being caught and ignored, I realized my family was slowly discovering a dangerous truth. My quiet husband was immune to their usual tactics, and their control over the narrative was beginning to slip. I waited until Savannah stormed out of the barn before I emerged from behind the shipping pallets, knowing exactly what I had to do next to prepare for the final battle at the dinner table. The heavy metal side door clicked shut behind David, leaving Savannah alone in the center of the utility barn. The thrum of the diesel generator vibrated through the cracked concrete floor, shaking the dust from the corrugated tin roof. She stood rigid in the stark fluorescent glare, staring at the closed door with her hands balled into tight fists at her sides. Her carefully curated image of effortless superiority was fracturing under the weight of her own petty failure. I stepped out from the shadows of the stacked shipping pallets. My shoes scraped softly against the gritty floor. "I saw what you did," I said. I kept my voice flat and clinical. It was the exact tone I use at the rural health clinic when a patient tries to lie about their symptoms. It leaves no room for debate and offers no emotional foothold for the listener to manipulate. Savannah whipped around. For a fraction of a second, genuine shock registered in her eyes. I am the invisible sister, the one who manages the background logistics while she occupies the spotlight. She is accustomed to looking right past me. Finding me standing between her and the exit, having witnessed her attempt at sabotage, temporarily short-circuited her usual defenses. But the shock evaporated quickly, replaced by a cold, hardened arrogance. She did not blush. She did not offer a stammering excuse or attempt to deny her actions. She simply crossed her arms over her silk blouse, tilting her chin upward. In that harsh light, the sweet Southern sister act vanished entirely, revealing the calculating entitlement underneath. "He does not belong here, Blythe," she stated, her voice slicing through the mechanical roar of the engine. She took a slow step forward, no longer bothering to hide her disdain. She told me David was nothing but a spreadsheet pusher. She claimed he was an urban nuisance who lacked the grit and the heritage required to understand the stakes of this weekend. She declared that she and Wyatt were actively trying to save the legacy of our family, and my husband was just standing in their way. Here is a concise truth about my sister. From the time we were young girls catching fireflies in the front yard, Savannah was shielded from accountability. If a window broke, the wind did it. If a grade slipped, the teacher was at fault. Loretta spent 2 decades insulating Savannah from the consequences of her own actions, cultivating a dangerous belief that the rules governing ordinary people simply did not apply to her. She believed her status as the golden child granted her the right to destroy anything or anyone she deemed inconvenient. I let her words hang in the humid, oily air of the barn. I did not rush to defend David's career again. I did not point out that the spreadsheet pusher had just restored the electricity while she was busy kicking fuel lines. I just let the silence stretch, forcing her to hear the hollow echo of her own entitlement. Saving the legacy by selling the North Pasture to Wyatt's developer friend, I asked. The question landed like a physical blow. The color drained from her face in an instant, leaving her skin a pale, sickly shade under the overhead bulbs. Her crossed arms loosened. The confident sneer melted into an expression of cornered panic. By uttering that single sentence, I had irrevocably altered the power dynamic of our relationship. I had tipped my hand. I escalated the conflict from a quiet domestic dispute into an open confrontation over the future of the estate. I showed her that the invisible sister had been listening, observing, and collecting the very data they were trying so hard to conceal. Savannah struggled to regain her footing. She opened her mouth, but the smooth, rehearsed lies failed to materialize. I did not give her the chance to recover her balance. I told her the truth about our grandfather. I stated that Harlan was not a fool. His knees might be failing and his pace might be slower, but his intellect remained as sharp as the barbed wire lining our property boundaries. I told her I was not a fool either. I knew about the 3 years of delinquent property taxes. I knew about the impending county seizure. I knew their entire scheme was built on a foundation of secret debt and financial negligence. For a moment, I saw genuine fear flicker in her eyes. The carefully constructed facade of her prosperous marriage and her secure future was teetering on the edge of exposure. If the extended relatives gathered in the house discovered the truth about the unpaid taxes and the developer deal, the social fallout would be catastrophic for both her and Loretta. But Savannah is a creature of survival, trained by our mother to attack when her reputation is threatened. The fear vanished, replaced by a desperate, venomous anger. She stepped closer to me, closing the distance, until I could smell the expensive floral perfume radiating from her skin. she sneered, curling her lip in profound disgust. She asked me if I honestly thought Grandpa Harlan cared about the opinions of a clinic administrator and a city boy. She used my profession as a weapon, tossing the words out as if organizing rural health care was a shameful, insignificant hobby compared to her role as a local socialite. She dismissed my intellect and my husband's worth in the same breath, clinging to the only currency she understood. Then she dropped the trump card she believed would end the war. "Mom holds the power of attorney, Blythe," she whispered, her tone dripping with toxic triumph. She leaned in, ensuring I heard every syllable over the noise of the generator. "It is already done. The papers are being signed at dinner." She did not wait for my response. She turned on her heel and marched toward the sliding doors, her posture rigid with false victory. She walked out into the pouring rain, leaving me alone in the vibrating utility barn. She was racing back to the house, desperate to accelerate their timeline and secure the signatures before I could formulate a plan to stop them. I watched her silhouette disappear into the stormy darkness. My pulse drummed a steady, calm rhythm against my collarbone. Savannah was incredibly confident in her paperwork. She believed that a legal document granted years ago gave my mother the absolute authority to dismantle the estate and sell our heritage to the highest bidder. She was banking her entire future on that single piece of leverage. She assumed that David and I would surrender in the face of a notarized document, resigning ourselves to defeat because we lacked the pedigree to fight back. But Savannah did not understand the true nature of the adversary she was facing. She did not know that navigating complex legal frameworks, analyzing binding contracts, and auditing official records are the very skills David and I utilize every single day in our respective careers. Paperwork is not a weapon that intimidates us. It is a language we speak fluently. Savannah was playing a high-stakes game of chess, but she was operating from a severely outdated ledger. She thought the power of attorney was an unbreakable shield. She had no idea that the foundation of her legal strategy had already been dismantled, examined, and rendered entirely useless days before we even packed our bags for this reunion. I turned off the brass flashlight, leaving it on the workbench. I stepped out of the barn and walked back toward the illuminated house, letting the cool rain wash away the tension of the confrontation. The table was being set for dinner, and my mother was preparing to execute her grand theft in front of the entire family. They were bringing a forged narrative to a battle of authenticated facts, and the impending collision was going to shatter everything they held dear. I stepped through the heavy back door, shaking the cold rainwater from my hair, and returned to the suffocating warmth of the main house. The restored electricity hummed through the walls, casting a bright, unforgiving glow over the gathering. Relatives were migrating from the parlor toward the formal dining room, drawn by the scent of roasted pork, glazed carrots, and fresh yeast rolls. The air was thick with loud, overlapping conversations and the clinking of expensive silverware. Savannah was already seated near the head of the table, her silk blouse perfectly dry, whispering into Wyatt's ear. She shot me a brief, venomous glare before pasting her sweet southern smile back into place. The board was set. The players were taking their seats. Then the heavy brass knob of the downstairs master bedroom turned. The hallway fell into a sudden, respectful hush. The rhythmic, dull thud of a wooden cane striking the hardwood floor announced his arrival. Grandpa Harlan finally emerged from his quarters. Here is what you need to understand about the patriarch of this family. Harlan is 82 years old. He possesses a gaze that can strip paint off a barn wall. His shoulders are stooped now, bent by decades of fighting unpredictable seasons and fluctuating crop prices. But his physical decline is an inaccurate measure of his fortitude. 50 years ago, he bought this acreage when it was nothing but dense brush and rocky soil. He cleared the timber with his own hands, pulled the stumps using a rusted tractor, and built a profitable agricultural enterprise through sheer, unrelenting discipline. His knuckles are permanently swollen from arthritis, scarred by barbed wire and heavy machinery. For the past 2 years, my mother and sister used his aching joints as an excuse to treat him like a fragile, diminishing burden. They orchestrated a slow, deliberate campaign of isolation. Loretta intercepted his mail, claiming she was helping him manage his bills. Savannah stopped inviting his old farming friends over, arguing that visitors tired him out. They slowly stripped away his autonomy under the guise of loving care, steadily building a case for his incompetence. They wanted the extended family to view him as a fading relic who desperately needed his capable daughter to manage his complex estate. As Harlan stepped into the corridor, leaning heavily on his carved oak cane, Loretta immediately swooped in. She abandoned her hosting duties and rushed to his side, hovering inches away from his elbow like an anxious nurse. She did not offer a normal greeting. She adopted a loud, slow, syrupy cadence. It was the exact tone a preschool teacher uses to coax a toddler into cooperation. She projected her voice so every cousin and aunt in the vicinity could witness her dutiful burden. She guided him toward the dining room, instructing him to watch his step on the flat, unobstructed rug. She patted his shoulder, assuring him that everything was prepared for his comfort. Then she pointed toward the head of the table. "Here is your special chair, Daddy," she cooed, ensuring her voice carried over the ambient noise. "Do not worry about a thing tonight. Wyatt is going to sit right next to you and cut your meat so you do not have to struggle with the knife." It was a breathtaking display of public humiliation. She was not offering assistance. She was broadcasting a diagnosis. By offering the golden son-in-law as a designated caretaker for a simple meal, she was cementing the narrative that Harlan was incapable of feeding himself. She was feeding the extended family the lie that the patriarch was helpless, paving the smooth legal road for the documents she planned to slide in front of him before the dessert plates were cleared. Harlan did not acknowledge her. He did not blink. He did not offer a polite smile or a nod of gratitude for her condescending performance. He simply stopped walking, his cane planted firmly on the woven runner, and looked right past her pastel dress. His sharp eyes scanned the crowded dining room and locked directly onto David. My husband was standing quietly near the antique sideboard, far away from the center of attention. He had been observing the room with the clinical detachment of a systems auditor analyzing a faulty network. When Harlan caught his eye, David did not need a verbal command. He recognized the specific, unspoken requirements of a man who just wanted to exist in his own home without being treated like a ward of the state. This was the pebble moment. It was the tiny, critical shift in momentum that signaled the coming avalanche. Without being asked, David turned and walked to the small end table near the parlor entrance. He picked up Harlan's preferred tortoiseshell reading glasses, which my mother had intentionally moved out of reach earlier that afternoon to prevent him from reviewing any documents. Then David stepped over to the crystal decanter resting on the serving cart. He poured a generous measure of aged bourbon into a heavy glass, neat exactly the way the old man had ordered it for 40 years before Loretta decided alcohol was too dangerous for his frail constitution. David walked past Wyatt, bypassed my hovering mother, and stepped directly into Harlan's personal space. He handed the reading glasses to the patriarch. Then he offered the glass of amber liquid. Harlan took the glass with a steady, unshakable grip. He slipped the spectacles into his breast pocket. He looked at the IT specialist from Chicago, the man my family deemed an unworthy outsider, and raised the bourbon an inch in silent salute. "Thank you, son," Harlan said. His voice was not frail. It was a deep, resonant baritone that cut through the lingering chatter of the dining room. It carried the unmistakable weight of lucid, unclouded authority. Calling my husband son in front of Wyatt was a calculated endorsement, a subtle but profound rejection of the hierarchy my mother had spent the entire afternoon trying to enforce. Loretta stood frozen in her tailored dress. A visible spasm seized the corner of her left eye. A distinct, uncontrollable twitch betrayed the panic bubbling beneath her southern charm. Her carefully constructed scene of the helpless elder relying on the strong, capable Wyatt had been effortlessly dismantled by a single exchange. David had treated Harlan like a man, granting him the dignity of his preferred drink and his necessary tools, subverting the narrative of incompetence my mother was trying to sell. Watching Harlan interact with David, a terrifying, beautiful clarity washed over me. I looked closely at my grandfather. I saw the sharp, assessing glint in his pupils. I noticed the firm set of his jaw and the deliberate, measured way he surveyed the relatives settling into their chairs. Harlan was not slipping. He was not losing his grip on reality. He was playing possum. For months, he had allowed Loretta and Savannah to believe their insidious campaign was working. He let them speak loudly to him. He let them manage his trivial affairs. He watched them whisper in the hallways and plot with local developers. He had been sitting silently in his downstairs bedroom, absorbing every piece of data, tracking every slight, and evaluating the true character of the people waiting to inherit his wealth. He knew exactly what they were planning to do tonight. The tension in the room ratcheted up another notch, transforming the air into a suffocating, heavy blanket. Wyatt shifted uncomfortably on his feet, his stolen glory evaporating under the old man's piercing stare. The casual family dinner had officially ended. We all moved toward the long oak dining table, taking our assigned seats. The clatter of porcelain plates and silver cutlery felt like the drawing of weapons. We were no longer gathering for a reunion meal. We were taking our positions on a designated battleground, and the final layers of this war were about to be fought under the bright, buzzing light of the restored chandelier. Dinner commenced with the heavy, orchestrated rhythm of a formal Southern banquet. 30 relatives claimed their assigned seats around the sprawling dining table. The thick mahogany surface groaned under the weight of porcelain serving platters, silver gravy boats, and crystal decanters. The air grew thick, heavy with the rich scent of roasted pork, glazed root vegetables, and the metallic tang of unspoken threats. Harlan sat at the head of the table. He ate his meal in a steady silence, his tortoiseshell reading glasses tucked neatly into his breast pocket, his bourbon resting near his right hand. Wyatt sat directly to his left, attempting to project an aura of command, though he nervously avoided meeting the patriarch's sharp gaze. Savannah sat beside her husband, her composure fully restored after our confrontation in the utility barn, emboldened by the sheer number of allies surrounding her. David and I were placed at the far end of the arrangement, seated near the swinging kitchen doors. This positioning was a deliberate geographical insult, ensuring we were the last to receive the passing dishes and the first to experience the draft from the hallway. We sat side by side, observing the theater unfolding before us. Here is a crucial detail regarding my mother and her dinner parties. Loretta views the evening meal not as an opportunity for familial bonding, but as a formal broadcast. For 2 decades, she utilized the reunion toast to dictate the social hierarchy of our bloodline. She used her crystal goblet and a butter knife to publicly declare who was rising in favor and who was falling into disgrace. The relatives understood this ritual perfectly. They knew that whoever Loretta praised was protected, and whoever she diminished was open season for mockery. Today, her agenda was transparent. She needed to officially elevate Wyatt to the status of heir apparent and permanently subjugate David before she brought the legal paperwork into the light. The food on my plate grew cold. I stared at a portion of glazed carrots, my appetite entirely ruined by the toxic atmosphere of the room. I watched my uncles tear into their fresh yeast rolls, their faces flushed with wine and unearned pride. They were eager participants in the theater of exclusion. In families structured like mine, the collective requires a scapegoat. The group cohesion relies on identifying an outsider to absorb the shared insecurities of the bloodline. David was designated to carry that burden today, a convenient target for people who possessed inherited wealth but lacked any real personal achievement. Halfway through the main course, the ambient chatter began to lull. Loretta stood up, smoothing the front of her pastel linen dress. She picked up her crystal wine glass. She retrieved a silver knife from her place setting and tapped the blade against the rim. The sharp, clear chime cut through the room. The clatter of forks against porcelain ceased instantly. 30 faces turned toward the matriarch, waiting for their instructions. She began her speech with a practiced, sweeping tribute to our heritage. She spoke about the deep roots of the Appalachian soil. She painted a romantic picture of the ancestors who cleared the timber and built the foundation of the estate. She wove a compelling narrative of grit, survival, and generational wealth, conveniently omitting the stark reality of the delinquent property taxes and the impending county foreclosure. She projected unquestionable prosperity, staring down the very people she was preparing to betray. Then she pivoted. She raised her glass toward the upper end of the table, directing the attention of the room to the golden couple. She praised Savannah and Wyatt, her voice trembling with manufactured emotion. She declared them the true future of the estate. She proclaimed that their dedication to the land and their understanding of our distinct culture made them the rightful stewards of the family legacy. The uncles nodded in solemn agreement. The aunts raised their glasses in a silent salute. The entire room swallowed the delusion without a single question, captivated by the comforting lie. Loretta let the applause settle. She took a slow sip of her wine. Then she turned her eyes down the length of the long table, locking her gaze directly onto David. The manufactured emotion vanished, replaced by a sweet, calculated cruelty. It was the same lethal expression she had worn in the living room earlier that afternoon. She adjusted her posture, ensuring every relative could hear her next words clearly. And to David she said, letting her voice drip with a cloying, condescending pity, "Who tries so hard to fit into a world he simply does not understand." The dining room went entirely still. The silence was profound, heavy with the weight of the public insult. Loretta did not stop. She leaned forward, slightly twisting the knife. "We appreciate you fixing the back screen door today, dear," she continued, offering a patronizing nod. "It is always good to have handy help around the house." The attack was naked and precise. It was the ultimate public humiliation, a targeted strike designed to strip him of his dignity and cement his status as the hired hand in front of the entire bloodline. She wanted the cousins to view him as nothing more than an unpaid repairman, a foolish outsider desperate for approval he would never receive. A low ripple of laughter moved through the table. Cousin Caleb chuckled into his linen napkin, hiding his amusement behind the fabric. An aunt seated near the window offered a quiet, mocking sigh. Savannah beamed from the opposite end of the room, her previous panic in the barn entirely replaced by the warm security of her mother's public protection. They all waited for the breaking point. They watched David, expecting his face to flush with embarrassment. They wanted him to throw down his silverware, push his chair back, and storm out of the dining room in a fit of injured pride. They craved a dramatic exit to validate their prejudice. David did none of those things. He did not flush. He did not lower his eyes to his plate in shame. He sat perfectly upright, his posture relaxed and untroubled. He reached out and picked up his crystal water glass. He brought it to his lips, took a slow, measured sip, and set it back down precisely on the center of his linen coaster. His face remained an unreadable mask. He displayed the serene, impenetrable calm of a man watching a toddler throw a temper tantrum in a grocery store aisle. He recognized that Loretta's insult was a reflection of her own desperate insecurity, not a measure of his actual worth. Under the cover of the heavy oak table hidden from the judging eyes of the relatives, David reached over and found my knee. He gave it a firm, steady squeeze. It was a physical transmission of patience. It was a silent reminder of the strategy we had built together over the past 72 hours. I sat perfectly still beside him, mirroring his stoic composure. My heart beat a steady rhythm against my ribs, but I did not allow my face to betray a single ounce of anger. I kept my hands folded neatly in my lap. Resting directly beneath my palms was my smartphone. The screen was currently dark, but the internal processor was connected to the cellular network, searching for a signal through the storm clouds outside. I was waiting for one specific email notification to arrive. The message I expected was not a casual greeting. It was an automated confirmation from a financial trust officer located in a secure banking facility hundreds of miles away in Chicago. The arrival of that single electronic receipt would signify the completion of a transaction that would permanently alter the trajectory of every person sitting in this dining room. I knew the digital transfer was processing. I knew the wheels were turning in the background, far beyond the reach of Loretta's petty social manipulations. Because I knew what was coming, I did not speak a single word in my husband's defense. I did not raise my voice to correct the record about the repaired cedar stand or the restored generator. I did not point out that the golden son-in-law was a fraud. I simply let the moment hang in the air. I let Loretta bask in her cruelty. I let her raise her glass and accept the adulation of her siblings and cousins. I let Savannah smirk from the head of the table. I absorbed the laughter and the condescension without offering a fraction of resistance. In the realm of strategic warfare, interrupting an enemy while they are making a fatal mistake is a foolish endeavor. I sat in the drafty corner of the ancestral home, feeling the reassuring pressure of David's hand on my knee, and allowed my mother to build her pedestal as high as she possibly could. Every second that ticked by brought us closer to the financial deadline. Loretta believed she was managing the timeline flawlessly. She assumed the dinner hour provided the optimal cover of distraction and alcohol to obscure the legal theft she was about to execute. She was preparing to present the transfer documents as a routine formality, a simple signature required to keep the estate running smoothly. She did not know that her timeline was irrelevant. She did not realize that the true transfer of power had already been initiated, logged, and notarized in a server room 1,000 miles away. Her toast was not a declaration of victory. It was a premature celebration on the deck of a sinking ship. I understood a fundamental law of conflict that my family had never learned. The louder a person performs, the harder they fall when the receipts are laid on the table. The heavy dinner plates were eventually cleared away by a few of the younger cousins, replaced by delicate porcelain saucers and slices of warm pecan pie. The scent of roasted sugar and strong chicory coffee filled the dining room, masking the lingering aroma of the main course. The loud, boisterous conversation that had accompanied the roasted pork began to naturally subside. A heavy, expectant lull settled over the long oak table. Relatives settled back into their wooden chairs, sipping their dark coffee, digesting the heavy Southern meal and the pointed public insult Loretta had delivered to my husband just minutes prior. Loretta did not sit down to enjoy her dessert. She remained standing at the head of the table, her posture rigid, with an anxious, vibrating energy. She smoothed the front of her pastel dress one final time, then turned and walked toward the antique mahogany sideboard positioned near the bay windows. She opened the top drawer and retrieved a thick, heavy manila folder. The folder was visibly stuffed with thick sheaves of legal paper. A row of bright neon sticky flags protruded from the right edge, marking specific signature lines hidden within the stack. It was a tangible physical manifestation of the theft they had plotted in the dimly lit study earlier that afternoon. Loretta carried the folder back to the head of the table with the solemn reverence of a priest carrying a sacred text. She walked directly to Grandpa Harlan. She set the thick manila envelope down on the polished wood, placing it precisely between his half-empty glass of neat bourbon and his folded tortoiseshell reading glasses. She rested her hand on the back of his chair, leaning down so her face was level with his ear. She reverted instantly to that syrupy, patronizing cadence she had used in the hallway. "Daddy, just a few routine estate updates for you to sign," she cooed, her voice pitched to carry across the quiet room. The phrasing was a masterclass in manipulation. By labeling the documents as routine estate updates, she was actively minimizing the life-altering nature of the paperwork. She was signaling to the 30 relatives sitting around the table that this was merely a mundane administrative task, a boring necessity required to keep the ancestral home functioning. She was disguising a hostile legal takeover as dutiful, loving family maintenance. She gestured gracefully toward the golden son-in-law sitting to Harlan's left. Wyatt sat up straighter, puffing out his chest under his flannel shirt, looking incredibly pleased with his own perceived importance. Wyatt brought his notary stamp, Loretta added, smiling warmly at him. "We can get it all taken care of right now, so you do not have to worry about a single thing." Here is a brief piece of context regarding Wyatt and his official credentials. He works at his father's farm equipment dealership, a lucrative business situated on the edge of the county line. His primary role involves processing high-interest loans for heavy agricultural machinery. To facilitate these sales, he holds a state notary commission. It is a standard bureaucratic certification meant to authenticate tractor contracts. Tonight, my mother and sister were weaponizing that mundane credential. They planned to use Wyatt's ink stamp to rubber stamp the theft of a generational estate, ensuring the fraudulent transfer of the deed would appear perfectly legal and unassailable in the eyes of the county clerk. The audacity of the maneuver was breathtaking. They were executing a property transfer in plain sight, standing right in front of me, wrapping their greed in the comforting guise of family tradition. I looked across the expanse of the dining room. Savannah sat opposite from me, a slice of untouched pie resting on her plate. She caught my eye and offered a slow, smug smile. It was a look of pure, unadulterated triumph. She believed she had won the war. She thought the power of attorney document hidden inside that folder was a bulletproof shield. She was entirely confident that Harlan, manipulated by their months of psychological conditioning, would simply pick up a pen and sign away the land to save them from their secret debt. I broke eye contact with my sister and turned my attention to David. My husband sat beside me, sipping his water, his face betraying zero emotion. The dining room was dead quiet, the air thick with anticipation as the relatives waited for the patriarch to comply with his daughter's gentle request. In that heavy, suffocating silence, a short, distinct vibration hummed against the mahogany table. David's smartphone, resting face down near his water goblet, buzzed softly. The sound was barely audible over the ticking of the grandfather clock in the hallway, but to us it was the loudest noise in the room. David did not snatch the device up with alarm. He did not rush. He calmly reached out, turned the phone over, and lowered his eyes to the illuminated lock screen. I watched the steady rise and fall of his chest. He read the brief text notification displayed on the glass. He did not smile. He did not smirk the way Savannah had. He simply raised his head, caught my gaze, and nodded once. It was a microscopic tilt of his chin, a signal designed solely for my eyes. Then he pressed the side button, locking the screen, and set the phone face down once again. The notification we had been waiting for all evening had officially arrived. The digital ledger, housed in a secure banking facility hundreds of miles away in Chicago, had registered the event. The electronic transaction was complete. The money had cleared the wire, and the county tax assessor's office had processed the receipt. The conflict was now at a boiling point. Two opposing strategies were colliding in real time in our ancestral dining room. Loretta was relying on social pressure, familial compliance, and a forged narrative of cognitive decline. We were relying on hard financial data, liquid capital, and the unclouded, formidable mind of the man sitting at the head of the table. Loretta reached into the deep pocket of her tailored linen dress. She withdrew a heavy fountain pen. It was a beautiful, ostentatious instrument made of polished black resin with a solid gold nib. She unscrewed the cap with a quiet twist and placed the barrel directly onto the table, pushing it an inch toward Harlan's hand. Look at his hands for a moment. Harlan's hands are weathered, sun-spotted, and scarred from decades of brutal physical labor. They are hands built for pulling fence posts and gripping steering wheels, not for signing away the very earth he bled to cultivate. "Just sign on the sticky flags," Daddy Loretta said, her voice echoing softly in the tense room. She leaned down, placing a manicured fingernail next to a bright yellow tab protruding from the bottom of the first page. "It is to keep the land safe." The lie hung in the air thick and foul, poisoning the scent of the chicory coffee. She invoked the safety of the land to justify a plan that would ultimately hand the acreage over to a luxury real estate developer. She was asking him to sign his own execution warrant, assuring him it was a prescription for his health. The entire room was holding its breath. The older aunts paused with their coffee cups hovering inches from their mouths. The uncles leaned forward in their creaking wooden chairs, watching the exchange with solemn respect. Wyatt sat up even straighter, patting the breast pocket of his flannel shirt where he kept his official notary stamp, ready to validate the theft the moment the gold nib touched the paper. I sat up perfectly straight on my stiff upholstered bench, the urge to intervene with a physical crushing pressure in my chest. A desperate person would have broken the silence. A panicked sister would have stood up, knocked the heavy fountain pen off the table, and started screaming about the secret developer deal and the delinquent property taxes. I wanted to tear the manila folder to shreds and expose my mother's fraud to the cousins staring blindly at the spectacle. But I did not raise my voice. I did not make a sound. I did not scream. I kept my hands folded neatly in my lap, feeling the solid, grounding presence of my husband beside me. David had taught me that interrupting an adversary while they are sealing their own fate is a tactical error. I did not need to save Grandpa Harlan because I knew he did not require rescuing. I just sat in the drafty corner of the dining room, breathing in the scent of roasted sugar, and waited for the man who actually owned the table to speak. Grandpa Harlan reached out with a weathered hand, his knuckles permanently swollen from decades of gripping steering wheels and stretching barbed wire wrapped around the polished black resin of the heavy fountain pen. The contrast was stark. The pen was an object of luxury purchased by a woman who spent money she did not have, resting in the grip of a man who had built his fortune from dirt and sweat. The entire dining room held its collective breath. 30 relatives sat frozen in their chairs. The older aunts watched with solemn respect, believing they were witnessing a necessary melancholy transition of power. The uncles leaned forward, waiting for the patriarch to formally pass the torch to the next generation. Wyatt puffed out his chest, ready to apply his official notary stamp and claim his unearned victory. Savannah offered a confident, triumphant smirk from across the table, certain that her inheritance was seconds away from being secured. Harlan did not immediately pull the manila folder closer. He did not look at the bright neon sticky flags protruding from the legal documents. Instead, he lifted the fountain pen to the ambient light of the crystal chandelier. He turned the instrument slowly in his fingers, examining the solid gold nib with a calm, deliberate focus. The silence in the room stretched, becoming a tangible, heavy presence. The ticking of the grandfather clock in the hallway sounded like a hammer striking an anvil. Harlan lowered the pen. He turned his head slowly and fixed his piercing gaze directly onto my mother. "Keep the land safe from who, Retta?" he asked. His voice was not loud, but it resonated with a deep, rumbling authority that commanded the space. It was the tone of a man who had spent 60 years staring down turbulent weather, failed crops, and ruthless competitors. Loretta blinked. The syrupy, patronizing smile she had worn all evening faltered, wavering on her face like a poorly secured mask. She did not understand the question. She had spent 2 years convincing herself that her father was a fading relic, a man who possessed no remaining capacity for critical thought. She expected docile compliance. She did not expect an interrogation. "From the county tax assessor," Harlan added. The question struck the long oak table like a physical blow. Loretta froze. The false warmth vanished from her features in an instant, leaving behind a pale, terrified expression. Her eyes darted frantically around the room, searching for an escape route that did not exist. The tailored pastel dress suddenly looked ridiculous on her, the costume of a fraud caught in the center of her own stage. "Daddy, I do not know what you mean," she stammered, her voice trembling, stripped of all its previous southern charm. She reached out, attempting to place a comforting hand over his, trying to regain control of the narrative. "You are just confused. The paperwork is only for routine maintenance." Harlan did not let her touch him. He opened his fingers and dropped the fountain pen. The heavy resin barrel hit his porcelain dessert plate with a sharp, piercing clatter. The noise shattered the remaining tension in the room, breaking the spell Loretta had cast over the extended family. "You think my mind is gone," Harlan said, projecting his voice so every single relative could hear the truth. "You think I am just a tired old man sitting in a downstairs bedroom staring at the wall while you run this house. You think I did not know about the 3 years of delinquent property taxes." The cousins seated near the windows exchanged alarmed, wide-eyed glances. The aunts who had praised Loretta's hosting skills just an hour ago now stared at her with open shock. The carefully constructed illusion of boundless generational wealth was evaporating right in front of them. The family realized they were not sitting in a fortress of old money. They were sitting in a house on the brink of a government seizure. "You think I did not know you planned to sell the North Pasture to Wyatt's developer friends?" Harlan continued, his voice rising, gathering the fierce momentum of a storm. "You thought you could trick me into signing away my life's work today so you could cover your secret debt and line your own pockets before the county auctioned the soil right out from under our feet?" The silence in the dining room became profound, thick, and suffocating. No one dared to pick up a coffee cup. No one dared to shift in their creaking wooden chairs. The only audible sound in the vast space was the frantic fluttering of a moth hitting the window screen near the back patio. Savannah went ghostly pale. Her smug, triumphant smirk dissolved into a portrait of pure panic. She looked down at her untouched slice of pecan pie, her hands trembling visibly in her lap. The golden child who had spent her entire life shielded from the consequences of her actions was finally facing an adversary she could not manipulate or charm. Wyatt shrank in his seat. The rugged outdoorsman who had boasted about hunting leases and property management suddenly looked very small. He stared intently at the tips of his muddy boots, refusing to make eye contact with the patriarch or any of the uncles who had admired him all afternoon. The bravado he had worn like a shield was stripped away, revealing a coward who had conspired to steal an old man's land for a quick payout. Harlan was not fading. He was not a victim of cognitive decline. He was fully, terrifyingly aware of the financial ruin his daughter had caused through her status-obsessed spending habits. For the past 5 years, Loretta had prioritized her reputation over the actual stability of the estate. She hosted lavish holiday galas, purchased luxury vehicles, and maintained expensive country club memberships to project an image of rural aristocracy. She funded this theatrical lifestyle by ignoring the fundamental responsibilities of land ownership. She hid the delinquency notices from the county clerk. She intercepted the urgent letters from the tax assessor. She gambled the ancestral home to maintain her position at the top of the local social hierarchy. Harlan had watched it all happen. He had played the fool because it was the most effective way to gather intelligence. He allowed them to speak loudly to him. He allowed them to restrict his diet and manage his schedule. By pretending to lose his grip on reality, he forced them to lower their guards. He heard their hushed phone calls in the hallways. He saw the suspicious real estate appraisals left carelessly on the kitchen counter. He observed Savannah and Wyatt circling the property like vultures waiting for him to expire so they could carve up the acreage and sell it to the highest bidder. Loretta stood at the head of the table, her breathing shallow and ragged. The grand narrative she had spent 5 years meticulously building was disintegrating in real time. The public praise she had showered upon Wyatt now looked like a transparent, desperate bribe. The cruel insults she had hurled at David now appeared as the defensive lashes of a woman terrified of a man she could not control. Her siblings and cousins, the very people she had tried to impress and manipulate, were looking at her with a mixture of pity and profound disgust. She had brought a forged story to a battle of facts, and Harlan had just exposed her fraud to the entire bloodline. She had lost the land, she had lost her reputation, and she had lost the respect of the family she had tried so hard to rule. But as I sat in the corner of the dining room, feeling the steady, reassuring warmth of David's hand on my knee, I knew the reckoning was not over. Harlan had dismantled their lies, but the final, devastating blow had yet to be delivered. The true twist, the unexpected payoff that we had engineered in the shadows, was still waiting in the wings. Loretta stood frozen for a fraction of a second before her survival instincts engaged. She is a woman who has never offered a genuine apology in her entire adult life. When cornered, her primary defense mechanism is aggressive deflection. She does not retreat, she doubles down, twisting reality until she can cast herself as the tragic martyr. The exposure of her financial negligence hung over the dining table, a toxic cloud that threatened to choke her carefully cultivated social standing. She realized she could no longer deny the existence of the unpaid property taxes. The secret was out. The extended family was staring at her, waiting for an explanation. Therefore, she immediately attempted to reframe her attempted theft as a desperate rescue mission. She gripped the edge of the heavy oak table. Her knuckles turned white against the polished wood. She pitched her voice into a frantic, pleading register, weaponizing panic to regain control of the narrative. "Daddy, we are trying to save you," Loretta cried out. Her voice shook with manufactured desperation. "We have no choice. You do not understand how dire the situation has become." She swept her gaze across the room, appealing to the uncles and aunts, begging them to validate her extreme measures. She painted a terrifying picture of imminent doom. She explained that the local government had issued a final delinquency notice. She claimed that if Harlan did not sign the deed over to Savannah tonight, the county tax assessor would officially auction the ancestral estate on the courthouse steps on Monday morning. She described government agents placing padlocks on the iron gates and strangers bidding on the timberlands our ancestors had cleared. She used fear as her final desperate weapon, hoping the terrifying prospect of a public foreclosure would convince the patriarch to surrender his autonomy. "If you do not sign this paperwork over to Savannah right now, we lose everything," Loretta pleaded, clutching her hands to her chest. "Wyatt has a buyer lined up. It is the only way to satisfy the debt and keep a portion of the family wealth intact. I was only trying to protect you from the stress of it all." The cousins shifted uneasily in their chairs. The horrifying specter of losing the generational homestead sent a visible ripple of anxiety through the room. A few of the older relatives nodded slowly, succumbing to Loretta's manipulative logic. In their minds, a secret land sale orchestrated by the Golden Child was preferable to the ultimate disgrace of a county auction. They were beginning to view Loretta not as a thief, but as a misunderstood protector making difficult choices to shield the patriarch. Savannah sat up a little straighter, sensing the slight shift in the room's atmosphere. She reached out and placed a supportive hand on Wyatt's arm, ready to resume her role as the reluctant savior of the bloodline. Harlan did not match their frantic energy. He did not raise his voice to argue with his daughter. He displayed the profound, unshakable calm of a man holding a winning hand. He reached forward and picked up his crystal glass of neat bourbon, the exact drink David had poured for him moments before the chaos erupted. Here is a detail about my grandfather. He wears a heavy gold wedding band on his left hand. He has worn it every single day since he married my grandmother 40 years ago. She was a pragmatic, grounded woman who managed the household budget with strict discipline, a stark contrast to Loretta, who treated the family ledger like a bottomless wishing well. Harlan respected financial integrity above all other virtues. Harlan took a slow, deliberate sip of the amber liquid. He savored the taste, letting the quiet tension in the dining room stretch to an almost unbearable limit. Then he lowered the glass. He raised his left hand and tapped his gold wedding band against the side of the crystal goblet. The sharp ringing chime cut through the murmur of the anxious relatives. He did not need to shout. The simple metallic sound commanded absolute attention. Every eye in the room snapped back to the head of the table. Harlan surveyed the space. He looked directly at my mother. His gaze conveyed a depth of disappointment that was far more devastating than anger. He saw through her frantic performance, recognizing the selfish vanity that had driven her to risk the very soil beneath their feet. Next, he shifted his focus to my sister. Savannah shrank back into her wooden chair under the weight of his scrutiny. He looked at her silk blouse, her expensive jewelry, and her pristine hands, seeing a young woman perfectly willing to enrich herself by dismantling his legacy. He glanced at Wyatt, dismissing the fraudulent notary with a single contemptuous look that reduced the rugged heir to a trembling child. Finally, Harlan bypassed his blood relatives entirely. He turned his head and rested his eyes on my husband. He looked at David the man sitting in the drafty corner near the kitchen doors. He looked at the IT specialist from Chicago, the outsider my family had spent the entire weekend treating like a subservient laborer. They had ordered him to carry heavy firewood. They had mocked his profession. They had stolen credit for his meticulous repairs. They had attempted to sabotage his efforts in the utility barn. Through every insult and microaggression, David had maintained his quiet dignity. He had not sought revenge through petty arguments. He had sought resolution through definitive action. Harlan held David's gaze, acknowledging the silent partnership they had formed in the shadows. Then the patriarch turned back to his panicking daughter. "The county is not auctioning anything on Monday," Harlan said. His voice echoed off the dark oak walls, firm and unyielding. The declaration landed with the force of a falling timber. "The back taxes were paid in full yesterday morning," Harlan continued, his words ringing with absolute finality. "The lien is cleared, the property is secure." Loretta blinked rapidly. Her mouth opened, but no sound emerged. Her brain simply refused to process the data he had just presented. She knew the exact, staggering dollar amount required to satisfy the county tax assessor. It was a sum so large she had spent 3 years ignoring it, convinced that only a luxury real estate developer possessed the capital to erase the burden. She knew the balances of her own checking accounts. She knew Savannah and Wyatt were drowning in auto loans and lifestyle debts incapable of producing genuine liquid cash. Her entire scheme relied on the estate being in imminent, unfixable jeopardy. If the debt was resolved, her justification for forcing the property transfer evaporated instantly. She was no longer a desperate savior making hard choices. She was simply a thief caught holding a fraudulent contract. "Paid," Loretta whispered, her voice barely audible over the hum of the refrigerator in the adjacent kitchen. She shook her head, unable to comprehend the shift in reality. "By who? We do not have that kind of money." Harlan smiled. It was not a warm, grandfatherly expression. It was a grim, satisfied curve of his lips. It was the look of a seasoned tactician watching an opponent walk blindly into an inescapable trap. He had spent his entire life evaluating the character of the people around him, and he knew exactly how much it was going to hurt her to hear the truth. That was the moment. The atmosphere in the room crystallized. The decades of social posturing, the endless cruelty toward outsiders, and the toxic entitlement of the golden child were all funneling down to a single point in time. The entire extended family leaned forward, waiting for the patriarch to reveal the identity of the mysterious benefactor who had saved their ancestral home from the auction block. Harlan took another slow breath. The first sentence out of his mouth next was the one that would permanently break the social hierarchy of our bloodline. It was the revelation that would make my mother drop her antique porcelain dessert plate, shattering it into a dozen jagged pieces across the original hardwood floor. David paid it, Harlan stated simply. David's firm bought the debt, and he paid the county in full. Loretta's hands went slack. The antique porcelain dessert plate she had been gripping slipped through her fingers. It hit the original oak hardwood floor, shattering into a dozen jagged pieces. The crash echoed through the quiet dining room like a gunshot. Shards of fine china scattered across the woven rug, a physical manifestation of her ruined scheme. She stared at the broken porcelain, unable to comprehend the seismic shift that had just occurred beneath her feet. The relatives remained frozen in their chairs. The information was too foreign, too contradictory to the narrative they had been fed all weekend. David, the spreadsheet pusher, the outsider they had mocked for lacking pedigree, was the one holding the financial reins of the estate. Here is the reality of my husband's profession. David operates in a world governed by verifiable metrics. He does not rely on local gossip or inherited prestige. He deals in concrete facts. 6 months ago, during a brief visit, he noticed Loretta hastily concealing official envelopes bearing the county seal. He did not ask her about them, knowing she would lie. Instead, he returned to Chicago, accessed the public municipal databases, and ran a comprehensive title search on the property. It took him less than 10 minutes to uncover the truth Loretta had spent years trying to bury. The ledger revealed an $85,000 deficit in unpaid property taxes. The delinquency was a glaring red flag in the county registry, a ticking clock counting down to an inevitable government foreclosure. While Loretta and Savannah were busy purchasing luxury vehicles and hosting lavish parties to maintain an illusion of wealth, the ground beneath them was legally slipping away. David did not confront them with this data. He knew presenting a narcissist with evidence only triggers a defensive counterattack. He brought the information directly to me. We analyzed the situation with the clinical detachment required for a salvage operation. We recognized that Loretta was driving the family toward a cliff, and she intended to take Harlan down with her. We decided to circumvent her entirely. We bypassed the noisy, chaotic channels of family communication and went straight to the source. I scheduled a private lunch with Harlan. I laid the printed county ledgers on the table in front of him. He did not act surprised. He confessed he suspected Loretta was mishandling the accounts, but she had systematically cut off his access to the banking records, leaving him isolated and legally vulnerable. That afternoon, the three of us formed a quiet, unshakable alliance. We did not hold dramatic interventions or issue ultimatums. We executed a covert financial rescue. For the past 3 months, whenever Loretta believed I was taking Harlan to specialized medical appointments in the city, we were actually sitting in the mahogany conference room of a prestigious estate planning attorney. We meticulously structured a rescue package. David and I drained a significant portion of our personal savings. We liquidated mutual funds and utilized the substantial performance bonuses David had earned designing corporate network architectures. We pooled our liquid capital to reach the exact figure required to satisfy the county tax assessor. But Harlan is a man forged by the harsh realities of Appalachian agriculture. He does not accept charity, and he refuses to be a dependent. He demanded a reciprocal legal exchange. He refused to let us clear a debt of that magnitude without securing our future. In exchange for the capital required to save the ancestral home, Harlan authorized his attorney to draft a comprehensive, airtight transfer of ownership. He quietly, legally moved the deed of the entire estate out of his personal name and into a newly formed irrevocable trust. The structure of this specific trust is the vital component of our strategy. David and I were named the sole exclusive managing trustees. We hold the legal authority over the land, the timber rights, and the residential structures. By transferring the asset into this protective legal vehicle, Harlan effectively neutralized any existing authority Loretta possessed. The paperwork sitting inside the manila folder on the dining room table was now entirely useless. You cannot execute a deed transfer for a property you no longer own. The trap they had spent months setting for Harlan was empty because the prize they sought had already been secured behind a vault of our own design. Harlan let the revelation hang in the air, allowing the profound reality of the situation to settle over the stunned relatives. He turned his attention back to his daughter, whose face had drained of all color. She stood among the broken porcelain, looking like a ghost haunting her own dinner party. "You wanted to know who understands this land?" Harlan asked, his voice steady and resolute, carrying to every corner of the dining room. "You sat at this table and mocked a man for not having the right bloodline. You questioned his grit and his character." He pointed a weathered finger directly at David. "The boy you sent to the back porch to stack wood," Harlan continued, the anger finally bleeding into his tone. "The boy who picked up his tools and fixed my cedar photo stand without asking for a parade or demanding a round of applause, he is the one who understands what it takes to maintain a legacy. He understands that you protect what matters through hard work and sacrifice, not through empty toasts and stolen credit. He saved the roof over your heads while you conspired with strangers to sell the ground right out from under my feet." The indictment was devastating. It stripped away every layer of pretense and vanity Loretta had used to shield herself. There was nowhere left to hide. The extended family, the cousins and aunts who had blindly followed her social cues all afternoon, now stared at her with a chilling, silent condemnation. The illusion of her competence was broken forever. Loretta's mouth opened and closed like a fish suffocating on a dry riverbank. She searched for a rebuttal, a lie, a redirection, but her usual arsenal was empty. She looked at the manila folder resting on the table, realizing the neon sticky flags marked the boundaries of her own failure. Savannah slumped back in her chair. The smug confidence that had defined her entire existence evaporated, replaced by the crushing realization that her inheritance was gone. She buried her face in her hands and burst into tears. It was not a quiet, dignified weeping. It was the loud, frantic sobbing of a spoiled child who had just been denied the only toy she ever wanted. Wyatt suddenly looked incredibly small. The broad-shouldered outdoorsman seemed to shrink beneath the weight of his flannel shirt. He slowly reached up and unbuttoned his breast pocket, slipping his official notary stamp back inside, desperate to hide the tool he had planned to use to validate a crime. He did not offer a word of comfort to his weeping wife. He simply stared at his boots, a coward exposed in the harsh light of undeniable truth. There was no screaming match. There were no hurled insults or dramatic threats. In families governed by manipulation and deceit, conflicts often end in chaotic, loud disputes where the truth is obscured by noise. But when you introduce verified data into that environment, the chaos dies. Facts do not require volume to be effective. There was only the quiet, crushing weight of legal, documented reality pressing down on the people who had tried to cheat their way to the top. The war was over, and the victors had not even needed to raise their voices. Loretta stared at the fragments of her shattered porcelain plate, her chest heaving as she struggled to draw oxygen into her lungs. The profound silence in the room was suffocating, a heavy blanket woven from the shock of 30 relatives who were watching their matriarch crumble. For several long seconds, the only sound was the muffled, pathetic weeping of my sister at the opposite end of the table. Then, the basic human instinct for self-preservation overrode Loretta's paralysis. She could not accept defeat. She had spent a lifetime bending reality to fit her desires, and she attempted to do it one final time. She finally found her voice. It was no longer the syrupy, commanding tone of a Southern hostess. It was shrill, frantic, and entirely devoid of charm. She slammed her palms flat against the mahogany table, rattling the expensive silverware. "You cannot do this!" Loretta screamed, directing her fury at my grandfather. "You are not thinking clearly. I have the power of attorney. I am the one who makes the legal decisions for this estate. That paperwork is already finalized." She pointed a trembling finger toward the thick folder resting near Harlan's plate, clinging to the neon sticky flags as if they were life preservers in a stormy ocean. She believed that document was an impenetrable fortress. She thought a single sheet of paper, drafted years ago, gave her the ultimate authority to override his wishes and sell our heritage to the highest bidder. I did not wait for Harlan to answer her. I reached down beside my chair, opened my leather tote bag, and retrieved my own manila folder. My folder did not have colorful neon flags. It was slim, organized, and bound with a single metal clip. I placed it on the polished wood and slid it firmly across the length of the table. It glided over the smooth surface, stopping precisely next to the broken shards of porcelain. "You had medical power of attorney, Mom," I said. My voice did not shake. I kept my tone as flat and steady as a heart monitor recording a healthy rhythm. I did not inject any anger or vindictiveness into the syllables. I simply delivered the facts, letting the clinical truth serve as the blade. Loretta lowered her gaze to the new folder. Her trembling hands hovered over the cover, hesitant to open it, as if she knew the pages inside contained the poison that would end her reign. Grandpa revoked that specific medical authority on Tuesday morning with his primary estate lawyer, I continued, ensuring my words carried to the ears of every uncle and aunt sitting in the room. He also updated his last will and testament. The estate is no longer a personal asset that can be liquidated to cover your reckless spending. The acreage, the timber rights, and all the residential structures are now irrevocably locked inside a trust. Loretta pulled the cover back. Her eyes scanned the top document, a certified copy bearing the fresh raised seal of a legitimate county judge. The legal jargon was dense, but the ultimate conclusion was unmistakable. "You and Savannah are not being cast out into the street," I explained, maintaining my measured cadence. "The trust grants both of you lifetime residency rights in the 2 guest houses located near the southern boundary line. You are permitted to live on the premises, provided you pay the standard monthly property maintenance fees directly to the trust account." I paused, allowing the conditions to settle over her. This arrangement was the poetic justice we had carefully engineered. We did not leave them homeless, which would have allowed them to play the victim card to the extended family. Instead, we provided them with shelter, but stripped them of their unearned status. We demoted them from the lords of the manor to ordinary tenants. They would have to contribute to the upkeep of the land they had tried to steal, or they would face immediate eviction. "But you do not own the land," I stated, delivering the final, crushing blow. "You will never own the land, and you will never have the legal capacity to sell it to a developer or anyone else." I sat back in my chair watching her process the new reality. Here is a fundamental truth about my family. They operate entirely on the currency of guilt, high volume, and public arguments. They control people by yelling the loudest, by twisting words, and by manipulating emotions until their targets surrender out of sheer exhaustion. In her world, a loud voice and a crying fit were the ultimate weapons. She could rewrite history by simply repeating a lie until everyone yielded. But a notarized deed does not care if you cry. A recorded trust document does not yield to a guilt trip. The county clerk does not accept a sweet southern smile in place of a valid signature. I do not deal in emotions anymore. I deal in signatures. I deal in notarized contracts, filed deeds, and verified financial transfers. My mother and sister had spent months plotting a hostile takeover, using whispers and social pressure. They brought a forged narrative to a battle of authenticated facts, and they had absolutely no defense against binding legal paperwork. By shifting the battlefield from the emotional realm to the legal realm, we had stripped them of their entire arsenal. Loretta stood at the head of the table, her eyes darting back and forth across the crisp white pages of the trust agreement. Her lips moved silently as she read the clauses detailing her demotion. She read the names of the managing trustees. She saw my name printed clearly in bold ink. Right beside it, holding equal legal authority over her future and her housing, was the name of my husband. I watched the devastating realization wash over her features. The color drained from her cheeks, leaving her skin a pale, sickly gray under the glow of the chandelier. For 5 years she had mocked David. She had treated him like an incompetent laborer. She had insulted his pedigree, belittled his profession, and attempted to publicly humiliate him in front of the entire bloodline just an hour ago. She had assumed his quiet demeanor was a symptom of weakness. Now staring at the raised seal of the county court, the truth finally sank in. She had alienated the only man who possessed the financial resources and the strategic intellect to save her from ruin. She had spent half a decade spitting on the one person who could have afforded to pull her out of the secret debt she had created. The power dynamic of my entire life inverted in 60 seconds. For my entire childhood and early adult years, I was the unseen assistant, the girl who chopped the onions and balanced the checkbooks, while the golden child received the glory. Loretta had held all the cards, dictating our worth based on her twisted social metrics. But in the span of a single conversation, her empire had crumbled. The aunts and uncles who had hung on her every word now looked at her with undisguised pity and disdain. The uncles who had nodded along with her earlier toast now leaned away from her, physically distancing themselves from the disgrace. The aunts who had admired her linen dress and silver serving trays now saw the desperate, hollow reality beneath the polish. They had not just lost the estate, they had lost the narrative. Loretta had spent her whole life curating an audience, and now that audience was watching her final, humiliating defeat. The social exile she feared more than anything else was happening in real time. The illusion of their superiority was permanently broken, scattered on the floor like the shards of the porcelain plate. They could never again pretend to be the wealthy, capable stewards of the Appalachian heritage. They were just two desperate women who had tried to cheat their own father, and they had been caught and neutralized by the very people they deemed unworthy. Wyatt remained silent, shrinking further into his flannel shirt, wishing he could disappear into the floorboards. Savannah continued to weep, mourning the loss of the unearned payout she had already started spending in her mind. Loretta slowly closed the manila folder. She did not scream again. She did not argue. The fight had been completely drained from her body. The undeniable weight of the legal documents crushed her instinct to deflect. I turned my head and looked at David. My husband sat in the drafty corner of the ancestral dining room, the new co-trustee of the entire estate. He did not gloat. He did not demand an apology or rub his victory in their faces. He picked up his folded linen napkin from his lap, he quietly wiped his mouth, set the fabric down next to his water goblet, and leaned back in his chair. He looked incredibly calm, peaceful, and completely unbothered by the devastation surrounding him. He had fought a quiet war, and he had won it, without ever needing to raise his voice. The air in the dining room hung stale thick with the scent of roasted sugar and the undeniable stench of a ruined empire. I did not wait for my mother to offer a rebuttal. I did not wait for my sister to dry her tears or for my brother-in-law to formulate a pathetic excuse. I simply reached across the polished oak table, picked up my manila folder, and stood up. David rose beside me, matching my deliberate pace. We didn't announce our departure. We didn't offer polite excuses about the late hour or the long drive ahead of us. We simply turned our backs on the broken porcelain and the weeping women walking out of the room. The relatives parted for us. Uncles who had ignored David all weekend stepped aside, clearing a wide path toward the hallway. Aunts lowered their gaze, suddenly fascinated by the intricate patterns on the woven rug. No one spoke a word. No one attempted to stop us or mediate the conflict. They recognized that the hierarchy had shifted permanently, and they had no desire to challenge the new authority in the room. We walked upstairs to the guest bedroom in total silence. The heavy wooden door clicked shut behind us, instantly muting the chaos downstairs. We packed our weekend bags with the same efficient, methodical rhythm we used to audit the property taxes. We folded our clothes, gathered our toiletries, and zipped the canvas duffels. David carried both bags, slinging the heavy straps over his shoulder. I took one final look around the room. I had spent countless holidays in this space, feeling small, insignificant, and desperate for approval from a woman who only valued obedience. Now the floral wallpaper just looked faded, and the antique furniture just looked tired. The spell was broken. We walked back down the grand staircase. The low, frantic murmur of arguments drifted from the dining room. Loretta was already trying to spin the narrative, weaving a web of excuses to the cousins, but her voice lacked its usual commanding resonance. It sounded thin, hollow, and utterly defeated. We bypassed the parlor and headed straight for the heavy front doors. The fierce storm that had knocked out the power earlier in the evening had moved eastward, leaving the night air cool and washed clean of the oppressive southern humidity. We stepped out onto the wide wraparound porch. The wooden planks groaned softly under our feet. Standing near the edge of the steps, illuminated by the pale yellow glow of the porch light, was Grandpa Harlan. He leaned on his carved oak cane, staring out toward the dark tree line where the north pasture met the foothills. He turned his head as we approached. He didn't look like a frail elder in need of rescue. He looked like the formidable patriarch who had cleared those fields half a century ago, his dignity fully restored by the legal fortress we had constructed. Harlan didn't offer a long emotional speech. He operates on a frequency of action much like my husband. He shifted his weight, freeing his right hand from the cane, and extended it toward David. David set the canvas bags on the porch floor. He stepped forward and met my grandfather halfway. The handshake wasn't a casual, polite greeting. It was a firm, lingering grip. It was a physical transfer of profound respect, acknowledging a shared code of duty and silent execution. The old man who built the estate and the young man who secured its future recognized each other perfectly. "I'll see you next month for the trust meeting, sir," David said, his voice calm and respectful, acknowledging the new legal reality they had forged together in the shadows. Harlan nodded slowly, a grim satisfaction returning to his weathered face. "Drive safe, son," Harlan replied. He turned his gaze to me, offering a single definitive nod of approval, a silent thank you for seeing the truth when the rest of the family chose blindness. He then turned back to watch the dark field standing guard over the land that would now remain intact for the next generation. We walked down the wooden steps and crossed the damp gravel driveway. David opened the trunk of the sedan, placed our bags inside, and closed the lid with a solid, reassuring thud. We climbed into the car. The engine purred to life, a steady, reliable hum cutting through the quiet night. As David shifted into gear and the headlights swept across the manicured front lawn, the interior of the cabin was suddenly illuminated by a rapid series of bright flashes. My smartphone, resting in the center console cup holder, began to vibrate endlessly. The screen lit up with a continuous barrage of incoming notifications. I looked down at the digital display. Savannah was calling. Then Loretta called. When I didn't answer, a rapid-fire sequence of text messages began populating the screen. I could read the previews without unlocking the device. Savannah was begging for a private conversation, claiming she never really wanted to sell the land, claiming she was just following our mother's bad advice, attempting to throw Loretta under the bus to save her own housing arrangement. Loretta sent a long, frantic paragraph demanding we turn the car around, insisting that family matters must be resolved face-to-face, promising that we could negotiate a better arrangement if we just sat down and talked like adults. They were desperate. They were scrambling to backtrack, trying to bargain with the people they had spent 5 years treating like garbage. They were attempting to rewrite the history of the last 24 hours, hoping they could somehow guilt me into tearing up the irrevocable trust documents and surrendering my leverage. I stared at the glowing screen. A year ago, the sheer volume of missed calls from my mother would have triggered a severe panic attack. I would have answered the phone immediately, apologizing for upsetting her, desperate to smooth over the conflict and restore the fragile peace at the expense of my own sanity. I would have surrendered my boundaries to avoid her wrath. But tonight, the vibrating plastic felt entirely insignificant. I didn't read the rest of the messages. I picked up the device, toggled the switch on the side to engage the silent mode, and tossed it face down back into the cup holder. The screen went dark, and the frantic demands of my family vanished into the shadows of the car cabin. David navigated the winding dirt road leading away from the estate, his hands steady on the steering wheel. We drove down the mountain in the darkness, surrounded by the towering Appalachian pines. The tall, ancient trees stood like silent sentinels guarding the property boundaries. The estate was safe. It was locked securely behind airtight legal structures, protected by a fortress of verified capital and binding signatures that my mother could never touch. We didn't secure our future by fighting their war of insults. We didn't win by raising our voices or participating in their toxic cycle of public humiliation. We won by building an impenetrable fortress of paper logic and quiet capital. The drive back to our own home took 4 hours. We spoke very little, letting the steady rhythm of the highway soothe the remaining adrenaline in our blood. We pulled into our narrow driveway long past midnight. The street was quiet, lined with modest houses and small, well-kept lawns. We unlocked the front door and stepped inside. The air in our house felt light, free from the heavy, suffocating expectations of the ancestral estate. We didn't have a sprawling, formal dining room or a mahogany table. We walked into our small kitchen illuminated by a single pendant light over the counter. We were exhausted, our bodies drained from the intense psychological warfare of the weekend. David opened the refrigerator and pulled out a package of deli meat and a loaf of bread. We stood next to the counter in comfortable silence, assembling simple leftover sandwiches. We sat down at our small, scratched wooden kitchen table. We ate our makeshift meal without crystal goblets or silver serving trays. I looked across the small table at my husband, the man who had absorbed their cruelty without flinching, the man who had saved my grandfather's legacy through intellect and patience. There were no hidden ledgers in this house. There were no empty seats waiting for people who would never arrive, and no secret debts threatening to pull the floor out from under us. We had stripped away the noise, the vanity, and the exhausting performances. It was just us, sitting in the quiet safety of a life we had built entirely on our own terms. I took a bite of my sandwich, feeling a profound, undeniable peace settling over my shoulders. I looked at the man sitting across from me, the quiet architect of our freedom, and realized it was the richest I have ever felt. When a porcelain plate shatters against a hardwood floor, the initial sound is sharp and brief. The silence that follows is the element that truly lingers. We spend our entire lives arranging these delicate plates. We polish the antique silver iron, the stiff linen, and curate a flawless presentation for the outside world to admire. As parents, we frequently fall into the comforting belief that if the dining table looks perfect, the family sitting around it must be whole. But the story of the Noel family is far more than a simple tale of hidden property deeds and unpaid taxes. It serves as a profound mirror held up to the quiet, vital choices we make while raising the next generation. It asks us to closely examine the stark difference between the legacy we project to our neighbors and the legacy we actually build within the hearts of our children. Modern American culture frequently confuses a polished exterior with a pure interior. We easily fall into the trap of curating a rigid family image. We obsess over securing the right zip codes, navigating the correct social circles, and chasing the external milestones that broadcast success to strangers. We dress our children in the finest clothes and shield them behind the safety of prestigious names. However, cultivating a child's external image while neglecting their internal character is like constructing a sprawling mansion on a foundation of loose sand. The storm always comes. When we teach our children to value the fleeting validation of social status over the quiet, unglamorous work of personal integrity, we set them up for a devastating collapse. Wisdom involves teaching them to build a reality that feels secure on the inside, rather than one that merely looks impressive from the driveway. When a child learns that honesty holds more weight than appearances, they develop an inner compass that no amount of social pressure can break. We must look in the mirror and ask ourselves if we are raising grounded adults who know how to stand firm in their truth, or if we are raising anxious actors desperate for a continuous audience. This brings us to the sacred law of cause and effect, vividly illustrated by the toxic dynamic of the golden child. It is a natural, deeply ingrained parental instinct to protect our young from hardship. We want to smooth the uneven path, intercept the failures before they happen, and cushion the inevitable falls. Yet, when we constantly intervene to shield our children from the natural consequences of their own actions, we do not create strength. We breed moral fragility and a profound sense of entitlement. A child who is handed every reward without exerting effort learns only how to take. They grow into adults who view the world as an endless resource designed exclusively to serve their whims, unaware that this unchecked entitlement will eventually bankrupt their own future. Contrast this delicate existence with the child who is taught to carry their own firewood. When we allow our youth to experience the friction of reality, they build a resilient, grounded spirit. They learn that fairness is not a given right, but a condition created through hard work and mutual respect. Morality is not simply about being good in a theoretical sense. It is about understanding the karmic weight of our choices. A parent's greatest act of love is often having the discipline to let a child feel the sting of a mistake. To navigate those mistakes, a child requires a steady anchor. In a society that frequently rewards loud reactions, public outrage, and dramatic arguments, we often misunderstand the true nature of willpower. We confuse volume with dominance, and we mistake anger for strength. Yet the most formidable presence in any conflict is rarely the person yelling the loudest. True willpower is rooted deeply in stillness. When we guide our children in the art of emotional regulation, we equip them with an unbreakable shield. The ability to remain centered and unbothered when others project their insecurities is a profound spiritual strength. Imagine teaching a young mind that aligned, quiet action operates on verified facts, and this action is infinitely more powerful than reacting out of fear or injured pride. When a family operates on guilt and loud disputes, they raise children who are easily manipulated by external noise. But when a home fosters emotional awareness and quiet confidence, it produces individuals who can sit at a table amidst chaos and simply sip their water, knowing their own worth does not depend on the shifting opinions of the room. There is a deep instinctual drive within American culture to pass down a legacy. We strive to leave behind tangible wealth, sprawling acreage, or a revered family name. We want our bloodline to signify something permanent. However, a physical inheritance is entirely meaningless if the spiritual inheritance is hollow. A lasting legacy is not a paper deed to a pasture or a heavy silver heirloom sitting in a display cabinet. A true legacy is the transmission of wisdom, adaptability, and the fundamental capacity to respect others regardless of their station in life. When parents focus their energy on cultivating the inner light and moral compass of the next generation, the material world naturally aligns to support them. The land will be tended by hands that respect the soil. The wealth will be managed by minds that understand true value. If you find yourself reflecting on the boundaries you set in your own life, or if you recognize the quiet strength it takes to break toxic generational cycles, you are not alone. Welcome to QT Told Stories, a space where we explore the power of calculated justice and airtight boundaries. Drop a comment below, hit the subscribe button, and join our community as we uncover the loudest lessons learned by the quietest people. We are all architects of the generations that follow us. The values we instill today become the emotional structures our children will inhabit tomorrow. Take a moment to look closely at the dynamics playing out in your own living room. Listen carefully to the things left unsaid between the clatter of the dinner plates. The truth of your family is not found in the smiling holiday photographs or the formal dinner toasts. It is found in the quiet moments when the doors are closed and the performance ends. Sometime soon, an unexpected storm will knock the power out and the lights will fade. When the heavy darkness settles over your house, you have to wonder, will your family know how to step outside and start the generator, or will they just stand in the shadows and blame the wind?